You touched on something which I think is a really important part of your journey, which is you became a mum, the two kids, and faced some challenges with that. So do you want to share that part of your journey as well?
Yeah, sure. So I had my daughter back in 2014, and so it was quite early on actually in my time at Philip Morris. I'd only been there about a year and a half. No, yeah, about a year and a half when I had her, and that was a really easy pregnancy. But then I struggled after. So when I had her, she had lots of health issues. She lost more than 10% of her birth weight at hospital. And
Wow.
then she didn't go back to her birth weight until she was about 8 weeks old, which is quite a long time. And so we were at hospitals, we were at the maternal health nurse a lot, we were, at the pediatrician, and she wouldn't feed and she would scream at me in the middle of the night. And I was kind of beside myself. Like I remember sitting there one night and just not even doing anything. Like she was just screaming, and I just sat there for an hour with her just screaming in my lap. And, eventually I convinced the pediatrician to try some medication for reflux, and it turned out she had reflux, and that made a big difference. And things started turning around after that. But I look back on that time now and I'm like, I actually think I had a bit of postnatal at the time, because there was a lot going on. My health was also not good at the time. I had some other autoimmune issues flare up at the same time. So there was all sorts of stuff going on. So it wasn't in a good way then. And it took me a while as a result to want to try again for a second child, even though that was something I really wanted to do, and I really wanted to have a second child because I have a very close relationship with my sister, and I wanted that for my daughter, right? So eventually we tried again, and that's when we had our first miscarriage. And I think when you've had one child, you kind of think that, it's just going to be easy the second time round because you've done it before. And so we weren't expecting anything different. And we'd even told our 3-year-old, which I wish we had never done. So we'd even told her, so she'd started, kissing my belly and talking to the baby, and then went for my 8-week, and I could see the OB's face change, and I knew in that moment that something wasn't right. So we had our first miscarriage, and it was a really unsettling experience. And I think it was the first time I really experienced grief at that level, because, it's funny, I think, miscarriage, when someone tells you you're miscarrying or miscarried, it's quite clinical in the way they describe it, and they talk to you about the fact that it was never viable, or it was never going to be a baby, or it wasn't a baby, right? And none of that actually really helps at the time, because, I was like, I've had all these dreams and this future imagined in my head about, my daughter playing with this, child, and building a relationship with this baby, and us having this different family unit. And so you're grieving not just the loss of the baby, but the loss of what was to have been, I guess. And so it really hit me. But I felt quite alone in my grief. Like but look, obviously my husband was dealing with it as well, but he was dealing with it in his own way and had his own grief to carry, and I had my own grief, which, for me also manifested in still feeling like I was pregnant, because I'd had a missed miscarriage as well. I hadn't had the traditional, what I expected to be a miscarriage, like you see in the movies. So it kind of was still there, and I had to wait for it to pass and all the rest of it. So it was, we just couldn't hold each other's grief during that time. And so I felt quite alone. And I realized, I think, in those few months, just how little we speak about it. And it was then when I was sharing with friends what I'd been through, that some of them would say, I had the same thing happen to me. And I'd be like, how did I not know this? Why have we never spoken about this before? And people don't speak about it until it happens to someone else, and then they share it in response to that. I was like, there's something wrong about this. But anyway, look, I carried on with life, went to work, pretended I'd had a cold, and just went about, day-to-day life, even though it was not quite really there. And then we tried again the following year, and this time I was really anxious about what was going on. So we had an earlier scan, everything was fine. Went back again a week and a half later, and again I had miscarried, and so this time we had the surgery. And I had just literally been promoted at work, so I was really busy. I was traveling, I was trying to build my team, I was trying to, get to know a whole new different peer group of people because I was now up one level. So there's all this stuff going on. And so I literally would go to work, hold it all in during the working day, and then come back at night and just bawl at night, just to release it all. And it was really challenging. And I think it wasn't until a couple of months later, I was talking to someone actually who worked on mental health stuff for our organization. And in the middle of our conversation, she turned to me and she said, "Niti, are you okay?" And I was like, there was something in that moment, because I went to respond on autopilot and to say, yes, I'm fine. But something stopped me from responding at that time. And I sort of, I paused and I was like, I'm not okay. I'm really not okay. And it was the first time I really kind of shared what was going on for me emotionally at all, like in my entire life, right? Like it just wasn't something I ever did. Like we weren't taught growing up to express emotion in that way. It was quite a superficial expression of emotion, if that makes sense. And so that was a life-changing conversation for me, because I realized after that conversation how much having the conversation and voicing what I was going through had helped me move further along the healing process, right? And it was at that time that I realized I need to speak about this eventually. At some point in time, when I can speak about this without bursting into tears, I need to voice my story, because it's important we start speaking about this more. And there were numerous times over the years that came after that where I went, I think I'm ready. Like there was a mental health thing at work and I was introducing it. I was like, maybe I'll use my story to introduce it. And I'd prepared it all. And then I got there that morning and I was like, I can't do it. I can't share it. And so I didn't. And so it wasn't until, I guess, 2020 when I was writing on LinkedIn, and some way into that journey actually, that I decided I was going to write about it instead of talking about it. And so I did that. But look, my story, unlike the story of a lot of others, ended up with me actually having a rainbow baby. And so I did the year after that fall pregnant again. And this time I did, we did successfully manage to have a child, but it was the most anxiety ridden 9 months of my life. Like every time I couldn't feel the baby move, I was like, there you go, it's happening. I'm gonna lose it now. And I had complications at the very end, which meant I could have lost the baby. So I was like, got to the end and now it's gonna happen, And so I really didn't believe that I was gonna have this second child until I actually had the child. Yeah, so it's been a life-changing thing for me, I think, and really changed my perspective on a lot of things, including the power of being vulnerable. And I don't mean just vulnerable out there in public to people. I mean just, your own vulnerability to express what's going on for you, even within the privacy of, say, a therapy room or whatever it is, because I think it's really important that we don't hold these things within us, because they can do so much more damage when we do that.
So then what are your thoughts about holding on to the news of having a child or being pregnant for 12 weeks? Because that's something, I assume it's common in a lot of areas in the world, but definitely most Western societies. You just hide it. You don't tell anyone for the first 12 weeks, because what if you lose the baby and then you don't have to tell anyone?
Yeah, it's a catch-22, isn't it? Right? Like we don't tell anyone because of the risk of losing the child and having to then untell people. And I have to say, the first time round when I had the miscarriage, I had told my family, I had told my daughter. Untelling my daughter was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life, because she didn't understand it because she was 3 and she kept kissing my belly. Even afterwards, and then wanting explanations around, but where's the baby gone and what's the, because explaining death to a 3-year-old is not simple. So it is really hard to untell people. But the problem with the 12-week silence thing is that because we don't share it, then no one knows what you've gone through. And no one knows that you have suffered this loss unless you then proactively go out of your way to tell people, I was pregnant and now I'm not pregnant and this has happened, right? Which is also equally painful and hard to do. So the silence begets more silence, right? And the silence means you then end up suffering in silence when something does go wrong. So I actually think, we need to get to a point where we are more comfortable talking about the fact that you're pregnant. Because also it's not even just the loss, right? It's, okay, I was lucky not to have morning sickness, but a lot of women have morning sickness really badly, right? And so if you're going to work and you're suffering from severe morning sickness or other complications in that first trimester, and you're not telling people, that's hard, right, as well. So it leads to other, complicating issues too. So I don't know, I find the 12-week silence thing a bit problematic. I think we need to get better at talking about it so that we can share it.
Is it just that we need to get better at talking about it, or do we need to get the right people around us where we feel comfortable talking about things?
Yes, and that's important too, right? And that goes to psychological safety, right? Because you're then sharing something that potentially has the possibility of becoming quite a vulnerable situation for you. And so, and it actually, even if nothing happens, it's still a vulnerable situation because you're telling your workplace that you're pregnant. And, there's a lot of other issues that, affect women that are pregnant at workplaces, including bias, promotion bias, and all sorts of other things. So, you are putting yourself in a vulnerable position. So, and this goes for anything, not just the conversation around having a child, but it's important within these environments to have psychological safety. And I think this is something many workplaces are still struggling to understand and to really, put their fingers on, how do you actually create psychological safety for people to be able to share these things comfortably? And again, it's a catch-22 because you only create those situations if the leaders in that organization are willing to share themselves, right? It's almost as if by sharing yourself what you're going through, you give other people permission to share as well. So as an example, through the pandemic, I was very open about how hard things were and how chaotic my life was and how much I was struggling, along the way. And because it was hard, I was burnt out. I was struggling with the emotions of it all, struggling with anxiety in a way that I'd never done before. And I was quite open about all of that with anyone who would listen at work. And, and it was, part of this is also about allowing other people to feel that they can voice their own concerns and where they are at as well. And I think leaders of organizations need to do more of that in order to facilitate these sort of safe environments where people feel that they can voice what's going on for them and they can show up and say, do you know what, I'm struggling at the moment and this is why, without a fear of repercussion or being judged or, any of those sort of horrible consequences.